pleased to, as you see, we're recording this, and the session video and any materials will be posted on our website at the end, and I will give you the URL for that in the final slide. I did just want to say that this is part of a series of activities that we're doing as part of our own grant from the Maryland Department of Aging, and we are promoting and supporting villages across the state of Maryland. Some of you have joined a few of our previous meetings. I might have seen some of you on April 30th when we had a program for villages about collaborating with government agencies and other nonprofits. And I saw some of you at 1 o'clock this afternoon for a special program for government agencies, AAAs, and municipalities and others about how they could partner with villages, because there's increasing interest on all sides to have villages and other entities collaborating. We better mute everybody. So anyway, and this workshop on grant writing is one of 3 that we're going to be offering. We'll have another one on bookkeeping for villages, which hasn't been scheduled yet. And then we'll have a 3rd on volunteer issues, which also has not been scheduled yet. Again, at the end, I will show you the contact information for follow-up information and where you can find the materials. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Seth Steele, who's our workshop lead. So Seth has been fundraising for more than 15 years, and he's the current Associate Director of Development with a prominent, I will say, Maryland health system. And I know that he has experience with both grant writing and grant funding, and that he has given very successful grant writing workshops for villages in the past, which is how we heard about it. So Seth, thank you very much for sharing your time and expertise with this. I think we're going to learn a lot, and I'll turn it back to you.
Of course. Thank you so much, Mary Jo, for the introduction. So now you know me, I want to know about you. So let's get to know each other. So we're going to have a poll come up. I've already looked at the attendance list, so I have an idea. We've got a really good, swath of people from villages and community organizations across the region, which is great. But I'm kind of interested in knowing a little bit about what is your familiarity with grant proposal writing, grants in general, seeking funding, kind of philanthropy as the entire sphere? So we've got none, like you have no idea what I'm talking about when I said any of that, to novice, you dipped your toes a little bit. Maybe you have some experience, you've got 1 or 2 under your belt, and then maybe you're a professional, you have more experience than I do, and maybe you should be teaching this course. So let's just see where we're at with everybody. Okay, so we've got pretty much everybody here. All right, good. So, all right, so most people, it looks like we landed right under some experience for the majority of people, and we do have a few professionals and a few people with limited to no experience, which is good, because we're basically going to kind of start at the beginning of the ground floor. But before we do that, one more question for you. This isn't going to be a poll, but rather in the chat, I want you to tell me what is one, make it brief, key takeaway that you would like to have from today's workshop. Really, what brought you here? Why are you interested in this topic? So just put it right in the chat, and I'll take a look at some of the answers. Okay, good. So we have effective verbiage to raise funds for a nonprofit. how to interest funders in supporting rural communities with small populations, learning the basics. Okay, do we have any others before we move on? Okay, how to have grant writing not be so scary and overwhelming, and how to frame a good ask. Well, that's great. This isn't scary. There's a lot of terms and jargon, but we're gonna cut right through it. And these are all really good. Okay, we have another one. Interest in current information on the subject, especially about evaluation. Oh, okay. Well, evaluation could be its own workshop. In fact, there's a book on that that I'll have to recommend to everybody. Um, but yeah, this is great. Okay, second on that. All right. Okay. Well, very good. So we'll go ahead and move on. Um, so just some of the learning objectives today. We are going to keep this. We're going to go through the whole cycle of everything with grants and really philanthropy in general. So it'll be a good primer on both of those, and then look at a sample grant RFP. But we will kind of keep this a little bit casual especially with the turnout we have right now. So, if you do have, we will have a Q&A at the end, but if there are any burning questions, especially around the break, we can get to them, especially if we're veering in a direction and something just pops into your head. We can kind of take care of it. But basically, we want to, well, go over the basics of philanthropy and what we call the giving cycle. Talk about researching funders, how to find them, uncover them. Going into the very basics of what is a grant proposal, grant writing, how do you write that proposal, and then do a real life scenario of going over this Maryland Aging in Place RFP. And then at the end, we're going to have some breakout sessions. Over with topics that you'll be able to choose based on some of the things we talk about. So you can kind of bounce ideas off of each other and use some of the expertise that we have in the room today. All right. So let's get into, once again, going back to starting on that ground floor of, well, first things first, what is a grant? So that is some type of fund that's given by a person, an organization. Usually that's going to be a public charitable foundation or a grant making institution, or in some cases, it can be a business that is doing it to meet their what we call corporate social responsibility goals. All of this is for what we call public benefit, and that is, basically needling down on some kind of good for the public, a positive impact on society, essentially. So I mentioned before the grant solicitation cycle. What does that look like? And this is not just for grants. This is, of course, for philanthropy in general. But where it starts is with what we call qualification. That's your research portion, finding funders, going into cultivation, relationship building, getting an invitation, writing and then submitting your proposal, finding out what that decision was, and then going into stewardship. And we'll define these a little bit more. So with qualification being the research portion, you're basically determining is what we call a prospect, that would be the granting institution, are they a good prospect for funding? And that's going to be related to what your actual objectives are and what your idea for your program or activity is. And basically, you are linking to that organization. It's a meeting of the minds, a marriage, if you will, of what you have and what they have coming together and then creating that good, that public good, that social impact. Cultivation, this is basically just when I say cultivating, it's building a relationship. It's the schmoozing stage essentially with a funder. And there are many different ways to go about it. We'll talk about those. A letter of interest, I put this in here for grants and grantors. In many cases, well, not all, but you're going to work with a lot of grantors, hopefully, that are going to ask for some kind of letter of interest, the LOI period, before you submit the actual full grant proposal. That really is going to be more for larger funders versus smaller, let's say, family foundations, but it can vary. The invitation portion is where you do get invited to actually submit that proposal. Solicitation, the full submission, essentially. Decision, this is going into whether or not your proposal was awarded or declined. And then back with stewardship, this is where you say thanks and let them know of the impact. So we were talking in the chat earlier about evaluating your program. That's going to be part of the stewardship stage. And once again, this is a cycle that goes in a circle. So once you're done with your stewardship and your evaluation and reporting back on what you did, that's going to allow you to go back to stage one with your cultivation for your next ask. So jumping right into it, we're in the cultivation stage now. What are we going to do? Well, even before we start that, and that's basically going back to what I said earlier, asking yourself, asking your village, if you're here representing a village, if you're here with another organization, why am I even pursuing this grant? Basically, what we want is to clearly define the program or the project that you are going to be submitting a proposal for, and really nailing down what is the goal. What are you trying to accomplish for the good of our community with this idea that you have? And this sounds really basic, but is it actually fundable? Is it attractive to foundations who are interested in funding that type of program? I want you to start there before you actually go into researching grantors and going into defining your actual project. So does it have a concrete measurable goal? You may have heard of like SMART goals, for example. That's M is part of that. We're going to talk about SMART goals a little bit later, but you want to make sure that it can be measured, because today some of you, more well-seasoned veterans here may have heard of, logic models, for example, in terms of your reporting. That's a big piece of it. Is that goal actually accomplishable, or can you make real progress over time? I've worked for years in the nonprofit space, starting in education, working more in community impact organizations that were focused on, health and, financial related activities. And we had very lofty goals. Not all of them are accomplishable, and funders are going to want to look at if you can accomplish it, and is that program sustainable, both in terms of monetary means and execution of the program. So, is that an ongoing program or a one-off program? And can you actually build that timeline out? If it's let's say you're planting the seed of a program and this is a pilot program, or you're in the first year, is this something that's going to continue over time? Or maybe you're just applying for funding for something that is a one-off. When you are looking at grantors and the actual guidelines, they're going to probably have that somewhere in there. And I think we have another thing in the chat. Okay. Let's see here. So what verbiage do you use when you started, but you're not a nonprofit yet? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but actually becoming a registered organization, especially for the RFP we're going over today, is actually going to be a requirement. I know it is a little bit of a chicken and egg type thing in a lot of ways. But there are some grants that you can search for through grants.gov, for example, for organizations that do not have 501c3 status. All right. So qualification, once again, this is synonymous with actually doing research. So you want to narrow down a list of funders who give to your area or of focus or that type of project. So you can look at awards from recent years. Who are they? Look at geographic area, determine if you are eligible with that grantor, and then what are their specific guidelines and funding process and their funding cycle. So some organizations, for example, may have an open cycle where you can apply at any time throughout a year. Some larger organizations do that. Some larger organizations may have a once a year cycle. They may have quarterly, and maybe twice a year, every 6 months. Everyone's going to be a little bit different. So understanding this, and there are resources that we'll talk about that will help you identify what that actually is. In some cases that you can go to their website and they'll have everything listed. And in other cases, you're going to have to really build a relationship with that individual to know what the answer to these questions actually is. Okay. And so, Raquel, I don't completely understand. You said today is a requirement. Could you expand on that just a little bit in the chat? All right, we can get back to that question in a little bit. So going to the next area here, some of the free research resources and databases. We'll jump into Candid in a moment, but GuideStar. This is a free resource where you can go on, sign up for Candid's GuideStar, and the basic free account will allow you to research grantors. So especially here in the DC area, for example, if you've heard of a particular foundation, you could go in and search for them and pull up the basic information. Now, all nonprofit organizations have to file various forms with the IRS. If you're a village on here, you're probably familiar with the 990N, the easy, the what's also colloquial called the postcard format that many of you file with the IRS. Larger organizations and foundations are filing a full 990, and if they are a granting organization, they will have a list of all of the grants that they gave out that previous fiscal year. And so it will list the name of the organization, the nonprofit they gave to, and the amount as well. So here in the chat, we're back. When you've already started the project and running a year, but not a nonprofit yet, a lot of grants want to be nonprofit already. Yeah, so that is unfortunately the case in a lot of ways. There are going to be some that you can research, and right here, grants.gov is a perfect example of that. They do have a section. If you go to grants.gov and you're doing a grant search, there is in their filter a checkbox where you can check off if you are a organization without 501c3 status at that point. So that is a filter. You're not going to find as many grants, unfortunately, in that case, but it is a possibility. Okay, we have a hand raised.
Yes, and I don't know for sure if we'll get to this in this session, but Raquel, I wanted to say, having been in that spot years ago, one of the ways that we navigated that process was through partnerships with an existing 501c3 or the idea of having a fiscal agent. So I don't know, Seth, if that might be something that we would go over before, but ways to try to navigate through that period.
Thank you for bringing that up. In fact, not to spoil it, but one of the breakout rooms we're going to have a little bit later is focused on partnerships and collaborations. And that would actually be a really good brainstorming activity to talk about. because that is the case in a lot of ways. And I talk a lot to other organizations about how we can work together, because we have a number of social impact organizations out in the community. In fact, let me go to the next point on here. Some of you have probably seen this on the WAVE website, the How to Start a Village guide. Hopefully you've already read that if you are here representing a village. One of the suggestions they have for fundraising during your first year is actually reaching out to other organizations. They mention Rotary and Kiwanis as two examples. And both Rotary and Kiwanis are not actually 501c3s. They actually do a lot of work with normal registered nonprofits in the community for community impact work. So that's actually a perfect example of what you just mentioned. So thank you for that. Really, really great. And another example is the Montgomery County Office of Grants Management for looking for local grants. If you are in Montgomery County, I know a number of us are in the Montgomery County area on today. There are similar offices for other government entities in the area. And I would recommend, if you are, in Northern Virginia, if you're in DC, if you're in another Maryland county, just connect with your local county government, or perhaps even municipality, depending on where you are. That is a little bit different depending on your jurisdiction, but they're all going to have some kind of governmental agency. And I know someone had asked me before about how that works at the state level. Typically with a lot of the Maryland grants, at least in my experience, you're going to see them basically a repository based on the individual department that's issuing them. So for example, in this case, the Maryland Department on aging issued the RFP we're going to talk about a little bit later today. And then, another thing that's really good to look at, I wanted to bring this up, and I don't know if Mary Jo, if you had issued this to everybody yet, but the RFP we're going to look at a little bit later, at the end of that had a few links to some grant writing resources. And in addition to what we talk about today, that's also a good resource list. I took a look at it, of basically going a little bit more in depth of everything we're talking about today. So definitely check that out as well. Okay, so we've done our research, and basically going into Candid, and I think we've got a little bit of time right now. So I'm actually going to switch my screens a little bit so we can go into Chrome and look at GuideStar as an example. If you've never done this before, very easy. But once again, I created a free account in GuideStar for this, and it allows you, basically candid.org or guidestar.org, they're all under the same umbrella, but it allows you to go in here and effectively search basic nonprofit search in here. And the other sections are, fortunately paid. But for this example, on the slide I had the Morris and Gwendolyn Cafritz Foundation as my example. If you're not familiar with them, if you're not from the immediate DC area, they are a well-known and well-regarded foundation in DC that have made an absolutely amazing impact on our community. And they have an open grant cycle with several funding deadlines throughout the year. But we're just going to do a quick search of the Cafritz Foundation. And, in this case, I knew the full name of the foundation, but you can, do a quick search and see. And even over here, I mentioned before, like looking at geographic area, I can go in here and search for organizations based on geography. So if you are in a particular state or county, you can actually look at that in even a metropolitan statistical area with the Census Bureau. You can look at those MSAs as well. But in this example, I've got the K-Fritz Foundation, and I can click on their profile, which is going to give me the basic information on here, who is on their board, where is, most of their funding. You can see they're basically funding projects in the DMV area. And they even tell you on here, without having to go to their website, basically, what do they focus on? So if you have if you're a village or a nonprofit here today, and you have a programmatic activity that you need funding for that falls under, for example, any of these areas, arts and humanities, community services, education, environment/health, then you're going to be eligible for at least that first step of going to the next level of cultivation. But there you go. And it even tells you on here, this is basically the areas here. If you're an organization, you basically have to be in DC, PG County, Moco, Arlington, Fairfax, or the cities of Alexandria Falls Church. But going into the actual financials, we can even go on here and pull up their 990s. And I had mentioned before, this is going to basically give us, their tax return, and we can go down here and look at some of the other organizations that they're funding. And, this is important because even if okay, they're funding health organizations or arts, you can go in here and look at the list and see, okay, what are average grant sizes? What are, is this organization similar to my organization? And that's going to help you get to the next stage. And, you can go on here and see that they're really running the full gamut, very large grants, medium size, and even, smaller. So, that's important because it just goes to show you, if you do have, this is $100 right here. We don't know exactly what it went to, but if you do have a smaller project in mind, then maybe you would be eligible for it. So something to think about there, but those are your basics with using GuideStar as a resource. So now we'll go back to the actual slideshow itself. Okay, so we've gotten our, let's see, and we have a few things in the chat. Okay, so we have someone up in Baltimore, perfect. So that's a good example. So now you know that this particular foundation would not fund your projects, but you'll be able to go in to GuideStar and use that either zip code or MSA to actually drill down on the organizations that you can apply for. Okay, so we got the research out of the way, and we've found some organizations that maybe they have the open grant cycle, they're accepting applications. What do we do next? So cultivation is the relationship building stage. We're going to make some friends now. So, how exactly do we do that? Based on your research, we just went in and in GuideStar, we were able to see who was on their board. But if you, I know I went really quickly through there, but on that 990, it had the full list of their board. Okay, so do you know any of their board members, or maybe you know someone that knows someone? You can build your relationships. Think of it as a relationship map to better illustrate your connections and how can you match your relationships together. You may have heard of 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Build out your relationship match, okay? And who's on there and how can I get from here to there, basically, to help open the door, because that's what this is basically about. So is that, someone introducing you to someone, or you kind of, being extroverted and going out and seeking those relationships? And, from my own experience, I think that being active in the community in some way, shape, and form is going to help with that, however you define that to be. But getting your foot in the door, you need to know the difference between an open grant cycle versus invitation-only foundations. There are some that will allow you to, larger foundations, they're using professional grant portals. They're going to have all these guidelines on their site, very similar to the RFP we look at a little bit later. But everything is going to be explicit. It's going to be up on the website. They'll tell you, okay, the deadline, the grant portal opens August 1st and it's going to close October 1st. And you have the 2-month period to create your account, get in, see what the guidelines are, and submit it. Others that are invitation only, that's where you're going to have to get to know somebody. And many of them will explicitly state this on their own website. Some may not even have a website. And it is really more about that, personal relationship. And just going back to your networks, how can you get an in with the funder? Cold calling, in my experience at least, doesn't work. I don't know, maybe it's my personality, I don't know, but it's really the long-term relationship building over time that is most effective. Okay, so what's next? How do we actually solicit the step-by-step process? I mentioned before, if they have the actual portal, you're going to need to register. And, you'll register on behalf of your organization, which is hopefully going to be a 501c3. Even in 2024, some local family foundations prefer it to be a little, I don't want to say old fashioned necessarily, but there is a grantor I work with every year that I actually mail a hard copy in because that's just what they prefer. So know their preference and meet them. And even going back to, the whole grant portal and who you register with, I am glad we got that out of the way up front about a sponsoring organization, because the organization, my day job, we have a nonprofit that we are the sponsoring organization for, and we work together on grants. In fact, we've applied for one of these Department of Aging grants before as the sponsor for that particular organization. So you need to know who you're going to register in that portal under. So if you've made it through it, whether going to the website, getting through a gatekeeper, and you have that invitation, just make sure that you have checked off all of the requirements. They can always change once you get into the application itself. Sometimes what you see as the guidelines on the website may be outdated compared to what you actually have in the grant portal. And even that is going to change often between grant cycles. So always be prepared, I would say. Go in as early as you can. Like if, going back to what I mentioned before, if you had a cycle of starting on August 1st, ending October 1st, don't wait until September 15th to create your login and go in and check on everything that first day, if at all possible, because you never know what may actually be in there, and you want to be prepared for anything. So now we can finally get started on the proposal itself. So when I say, going back to the ground floor, what is a proposal? This is basically going to be a concise document that defines what you're going to accomplish, how you're going to do it with the support of the funder right there with you. So basically, you're telling the funder, hey, if you give me, the funding, the money, here's what I'm going to do with it and the impact that our partnership is going to create. This is basically your ask for the gift and how it will be used. And some of the basic components that you're going to find, from grantor to grantor is going to be your executive summary, your narrative, financial documents, They may have other things they want uploaded, like let's say a brochure or something about your organization, any supporting materials, some kind of timeline as well. And then even going back to some of the evaluation tools. Those will most likely be built into the full narrative when you write that. So basically, you can think of a proposal as a more detailed sales pitch. Um, Basically, I want you to channel, if you're a fan of Mad Men from years ago, channel your inner Don Draper and get together that pitch of your project, how you're going to sell that idea, um, sell how you're going to create a better community and that impact, whether it's to the board directly, whether it's to the grant manager with that organization, or family. I think I've been talking a lot about some of the larger funders, but we have a lot of smaller family foundations in the community that are just as generous. Some of them are going to be hidden gems, honestly. They may not have the fanciest website getting their name. They may not have their name on buildings, but they're usually very generous, and they may not get as many applications because they're not as visible as well. So what really makes a good proposal? This is, in my opinion, I think it goes down to, once again, being very concise, not having a lot of jargon. You want to have that kind of, I would say, middle school, up to 8th grade level, reading level, just as concise as possible. Cut the jargon. Use Occam's razor as much as you can to simplify things, so that's very understandable. Is your project, your proposal, doable within the time frame specified? I want you to be realistic. This is something that a trap I've even run into in my day-to-day of applying for a project, that I may think, uh, hey, this is going to be very easy to implement. I'm going to get that check, and then I'm going to hit the ground running from day one. And there are so many obstacles and roadblocks that you can run into. So think about those. And when you're writing the narrative, you're probably going to be asked about what some of those barriers to your project may actually be. So you'll know those. You'll define them a little bit better. Detail what will be done, how, when, what is your story? Why are you doing it? I know we have some, other than the villages, some nonprofits that registered for today's workshop. So in those cases, you may have your own story of, if you started your own nonprofit, what was the story behind that. Basically, you want to have that to bring your proposal to life, so that it's not just pure business writing. You don't need to embellish it too much with a lot of flowery language or anything, but having that narrative will do that. And then going into what we talked a little bit before around evaluation, what are some clear outcomes that you can achieve? And then, of course, going back to square one, aligning with what the funder actually wants to achieve, what their funding objectives are. And they could be very broad, or they could be extremely precise. And when you're getting into the guidelines, when you were doing that research, you'll know the answer to that question. Okay, so quick outline. We touched on this a little bit before, but basically, information about your organization. You're going to want a history of your village or nonprofit, the executive summary of your proposal in the project itself, the statement of needs. So many of you have probably heard of like a community needs assessment. Going back to partnerships, this is a great example. You don't have to carry that out on your own. There are so many organizations, United Way, for example, of the National Capital Area, or United Way of Maryland. they have their finger on the pulse. They're doing community needs assessments on certain cycles. It may be anywhere from 3 to 6 years, depending on the organization. Local hospitals, for example, conduct community needs assessments. Other organizations, nonprofits around certain specific niche issues may conduct it around their issue. So partnering with those organizations, they've already done the legwork. There are so many, just to give you another example, there are so many organizations here. I'm based in Montgomery County, Maryland. So many here that are working to address food insecurity in the region, and DC as well. So that's a great example. That is a community need that was determined. You can latch onto those community needs assessments and using that data in making your case for the statement of need as to why your project is needed. And then, of course, government agencies, particularly the ones around here, have done so much research on certain things. So that should be relatively easy to get the data you need in developing your statement of need. And then going into your project description, just building it out of what your project is and what it's going to be doing. Budget, this is vitally important. You need to be realistic when you are developing the budget. And I want to say that in a lot of the funders you work with that have a formal grant portal, they will likely have a budget template that you will use. It's either going to be a PDF with fields that you're going to type in your numbers and the line item, or they're going to ask you to upload an Excel spreadsheet. It may be a template they already have, or they'll ask you to develop one on your own. But at minimum, if let's say you're building out your own budget template, it's going to be based on the line items of the project itself. What are the inputs, the costs, and then breaking down your revenues versus your expenses. A lot of grant budget templates will have you basically zero those out in some way. And when I say that in terms of accounting, you're looking at these are going to be my expenses, and then my revenues will include the grant that I'm applying for, but you're going to need other funding sources as well. For example, the RFP we look at later today will require 50%, I believe, of the funding to come from other sources. So that could be other grants you're applying for, that could be dues to your organization, that could be other income, that could be a fundraiser that you put together. A lot of different things that you could look at. Sponsorships are another example. And then all of your supporting documentation. So if you are a 501c3, you're going to have either the regular 990 or the 990 Easy postcard, depending on your revenues each year. Your IRS determination letter showing that you are a 501c3, or if you're not, what kind of registered organization you are, and then your finances, if you are big enough, to have that formalized audit every year, or just any kind of financial document you can upload. Okay, so best practices for putting together your proposal. Project Management 101. Get a game plan together of how you're going to tackle this grant. I would say if you're here representing a village today, form a grant writing team. I don't want this to all fall on one of your shoulders, but use each member's strength. So if you have someone in your village that is really good with data, put them on the outcomes and evaluation team to develop that process. If you have someone that maybe was in marketing and communications, have them work on the actual copywriting for the proposal itself to make it look really good. Right to the grant itself, think of this as like a interview of sorts. So think, maybe the last job you interviewed for, um, that's basically what you're doing. You're going to go in front, not literally, well, maybe, but you're going in front of a panel of the funder, because ultimately the proposal that you submit is going to go to some kind of grants manager first. You're probably gonna have that person take a look at it, and then they may actually forward it, if it passes that first check, to the board of that foundation. Depending on the grant cycle, the board may look at every single application that comes through. In my day-to-day job, I am applying for funds and requesting. In some of the community work I do, I actually, work on a open grant cycle for an organization that I volunteer with. And, we have a relatively open grant cycle where we are, myself and others with that foundation are going through every application. And that really is how it's treated in an interview. So provide the most relevant and timely information you have available. Going back to the most pressing needs of the community, those change. A really good example, it can change on a dime, is what happened 4 years ago when we had the pandemic. A lot of nonprofits, for example, pivoted instantly on addressing things. So I mentioned food insecurity earlier. There were a lot of those organizations that I work with here in Montgomery County that started in 2020 because people were out of a job, and food insecurity skyrocketed in the area because of that. So basically, what are those needs, and knowing that and providing that data so that the funder knows this is something that is going, once again, goes back to community impact, and that's what they want to fund and be a partner with you on. So we mentioned this before, but the executive summary description of the project, going into that a little bit more, the guiding question or purpose and importance of that. When you are writing your summary, I want to just say again, avoid jargon, use SMART goals. We're going to define that a little bit later. And then when you are developing your project timeline, what parts of the project will be done when, and what externally fixed deadlines might affect the project, annual versus one time. We talked about that a little bit before, but basically, is this a continuing funding opportunity or a continuing program? Two different things there. But this could be a funding cycle that you apply annually for a project that is annual in basically continuing on. We have something else in the chat. I'm an executive director of a village in rural Maryland. Although paid for 20 hours a week, I work more than double that time. My greatest need is to hire personnel who would coordinate our volunteers in a program developer. Grants generally want a specific program, not salary. Would you please address organizations that provide grants to bring on staff? That falls under capacity building, I would say. There are, it's really about how you frame it. So if it is, staff to implement a new program, that falls under the program itself, and that may be more palatable to the funder. That can be a sticky situation though, because I have to deal with that all the time. There are so many, when you are going back to the basic research, you're going to see, they will tell you outright in most cases, we do or we don't fund, let's say, capital. So we'll fund a building project, or we won't. We will fund, basically, I hate using this word, but overhead, because people are overhead. You have to have the people or you don't have the program. But in so many cases, but there are ways to kind of wiggle room around that, where basically this program can only be implemented if we have this person in place, and that falls under capacity building. And depending on the focus area of the funder, there are plenty of, small and large foundations out there that are more than willing to meet you in the middle and do that. I've had, pretty good success in recent years of getting grants to actually hire people on to address an emerging need in our community. So it really goes all back to that relationship and talking to them upfront about it. I'll just give you a really quick example going back to, cultivation and that relationship building. We use K-Fritz as an example. If you want to apply for a grant with the K-Fritz Foundation, you are required to go to either a in-person or virtual meeting with their grants team to go over all their guidelines and understand exactly what is funded and not. And so that's a great example of when you are in that setting, you would say, okay, this is basically what I'm looking at. I need to hire on this person. We need to increase hours here. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Then they're going to tell you whether or not that's doable. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so SMART goals. You're going to see this a lot. Increasingly, you're going to see this a lot in the guidelines. So what does this mean if you're not familiar with it? The S is specific, clear and focused to avoid misinterpretation. Basically, any assumptions and definitions should be easy to interpret. Measurable, quantifiable. You need to quantify things. Basically, can you have meaningful analysis here on the progress? Attainable, so it has to be achievable is really what it boils down to. We talked about before, in terms of being attainable, what is the scope of the project you're presenting for funding? And that goes into both the budget and the time frame, because you get tripped up in both areas. Sometimes with grants, when I'm building the budget, well, I would say even more so nowadays with inflation where it's at. When I build a budget, there's a lag time between the application and the actual decision making, and then the funding, and then the implementation. So I actually build in, for example, inflation into my budget. So I know that if it's like maybe 6 or 8 months later, I'm going to be covered, because whatever the cost of the goods or the people to implement that program has now gone up. All right. So relevant. Once again, it has to fit within the project or the funder's overall themes or focus areas of that foundation. And then timely, is the work doable within the performance period or within the award period? So, attainable and timely kind of go together in a lot of ways. So this is just something I made up real quick. An example of a SMART goal. Not the most elegant one, but it goes into the data and timeliness. So I made up a new nonprofit called Helping Our Neighbors. They are going to distribute 900 emergency health kits each week in Montgomery County, Maryland, to assist unhoused individuals from the period of July 1st, 2024 to December 31st, 2024. So this is something that is, time-based. It is very relevant. It is something that is attainable. It's measurable. When we go into evaluations, this would be really easy to evaluate because I could work with another organization in Montgomery County, like let's say Bethesda Cares, to know how many unhoused people in the community we need to have outreach to. We know what the population or in is, and then we have this many emergency kits that we bought with the grant. And then at the end of the day, when we're doing evaluations, we know, okay, we reached out to this X number of people and we distributed X number of kits. And we did it within this timeline. So that's a great example of, this would be easy for me to report back on. I did it or, didn't, but we'll go into evaluation a little bit later. So basics of proposal writing again, some anticipated barriers and challenges. What can go wrong and how would we deal with it? This can always be an issue of just anticipating barriers. Hopefully you can anticipate them so you don't have to overcome them. Or if you do have to overcome them, you anticipated them beforehand, so it won't be quite as big of a deal, but it's always going to happen. And you just have to be flexible and nimble. And if you already had them built into your project plan, then it shouldn't be a problem. Budget, I talked about this before, but your itemized spreadsheet, your tools, capital expenses, maybe you need to rent a space, example, for the implementation of your program. What consumables do you have? Do you have expenses like travel and any anticipated funding sources? And that really goes into sustainability because at the end of the day, a funder is going to want to fund something that is sustainable. If they feel like there's some cracks in this proposal of maybe this isn't actually something that can be implemented within the time frame or with the money that we give this organization, then much less likely to actually make it through. So how are the decisions going to be made? You've gotten through, you're in the portal, you've done a great job writing the proposal, you uploaded all of your attachments, you've checked it 10 times over and everything's looking great. You've hit that, you go ahead, hit the submit button. Now what happens? This varies from funder to funder. Some of the local families in the area that have the Small Family Foundation, maybe they're going to get together, during the holidays or during a vacation and sit around and go through applications together. If they're a larger family foundation, they're going to have actual program staff. And that goes back to going through the gatekeeper of who is the grant manager person. They're going to funnel everything before it gets to the actual trustees of that foundation who will make the ultimate determination. And they may have their own internal scorecard as well of, and sometimes they'll share that with you of, over all the requirements, what does this, meet in terms of needs. And then, just looking at scope. So you may be going up against within a funding cycle, the RFP we look at later has $100,000 as their pool. So you may be, basically applying with dozens or hundreds of other organizations for a smaller or larger pool of funding. And they unfortunately can't always fund everybody. And you may have a larger geographic scope as well. There are foundations that are funding programs locally across the United States and then even internationally. So I think that actually kind of also goes back to when we were looking at the research cultivation stage a little bit. Basically, knowing that is very helpful. Don't let, I just want to say, like, this may feel in some cases like you are on an episode of Shark Tank when you're going before and communicating with, trustees or others. And they may ask, you get in that, going back to the letter of interest. I'll use a personal example. I'm actually in the middle of a grant application right now where I submitted a letter of interest to a national foundation, and they accepted that letter of interest. It was actually almost like a mini grant proposal. And I then, myself and my volunteer team had to go before a group of people to discuss that letter of interest. And it was like, okay, some pointed questions about the project and what we were trying to address in terms of community need. But ultimately, those questions were being asked for a very good reason. So even though, may feel, a little intimidating, you might sweat a little, under everything, but don't let that happen, because once again, we're all in this for the same reason, and that is creating impact and making a difference in our community. So with that said, we are a little over an hour at this point. So right on time for a quick break. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. yeah, go grab a snack, some water, something like that, and we'll resume soon. All right, so steps wise, you submitted the grant, they've made their decision. Did you get the grant? Congratulations, all that hard work paid off. But now there are some things we need to do. So next steps. Understand the timing of the gift. I think this is really important. I mentioned it before. Just because you get that award letter via email or physically in the mail does not necessarily always mean that you're going to immediately have the check in hand. And this is vitally important to point out when it comes to government grants, depending on whether it's a local municipality or county government or state, that there can be a delay there. And that's also often the case even with some smaller foundations as well. Typically, I may get an award letter and then the actual transfer or check is cut. It could be up to a month later or later. So think about that going also back to your whole timeline of your project. Something to keep in mind there. In terms of grant management, I think this is very important. We talked about project management 101. Grant management in total, this needs to go into the whole planning process so that you're not caught blindsided once you do receive the grant itself. But do they have the documentation to follow? That will be outlined upon receipt of the actual grant, most likely. Think about outcomes-based tracking of your progress and your data collection methods. So when we were talking up at the top of tonight's program, I mentioned there are entire academic books, for example. Evaluation programmatically, especially for nonprofits, is a field unto itself. And there are a lot of things you can do depending on the size of your program. But, in terms of gauging your impact, look at perhaps if it's an activity that's community-based, have a registration or intake form when you have that event so that you're checking off how many people attended, their basic demographic information. You can keep track of that pretty easy. Most people are willing to provide that to you. That's a very easy idea to implement. Another one, a survey. There are multiple survey tools out there. SurveyMonkey is one of them that has a free version. I want to say it's somewhere between 8 and 10 survey questions you can put into a free survey with them and do limited data collection. But there are plenty of free tools out there that you can use for this, for your data collection, and then managing your actual grant timeline. Going back to the requirements, what are the actual milestones? So the foundation or other funder is going to tell you that they would like to have some kind of report out, for example. So when I am personally submitting grants, I'm going to have that of, okay, my check-in is 6 months from now, it's a year from now, maybe it's a year and a half from now. Maybe they want a mid-grant cycle check in to see how you're doing, or if you had any issues that you had to overcome. With some grants that I've actually given out before, I've requested, hey, let's do lunch at some point and just talk about the program and how things are going from that end and what you're doing in the community. I just want to build on that relationship and learn a little bit more. So you'll get that, but build that into your project timeline. We have one here from Mary Jo in the chat. If you are a first-time recipient from a government agency, it takes extra time to get into their payment system. Well put. Could be 45 days or more before the first payment arrives, and for grants that are reimbursable only, you only need to expend the funds and submit your schedule report and invoice to trigger the payment. Thank you for pointing that out, Mary Jo. Well said. I'm interested in how to work with matching funds and the use of volunteer hours and in-kind support for matching funds. That's really good to point out. There is a government standard, kind of like how there's a government standard for like mileage reimbursement. There is a government, well, it's not like a law or anything, but it's a advice of what you actually put hours wise behind each volunteer hour, what it's worth. So you can actually say, you know, we have X number of volunteers, this number of hours. In kind giving is its own thing that you can basically put on the books as in kind support. So depending on the grant itself, that can determine if whether or not you actually quantify that. And then we have another thing in the chat. In my experience with private foundations, their cash flow often also dictates funding timeline. Often we would fund someone 4 to 5 months from award, as our board of directors only voted 2 extra yearly on grants. Thank you for pointing that out. The foundation I work with that actually distributes grants, on the other side of the coin that I'm on, our grant distribution cycle, just a peek behind the curtain, is based on our investments, basically. And so usually, like for example, the end of last year was really good, and our grant cycle ends in December. And so based on that little bump we got, we were actually able to start cutting checks a little bit earlier than we were in previous years. So, you know, once again, it's funder by funder. So you can always just ask them, because I often have the applicants ask me like, oh, you know, what's the cycle looking like this year? When can we kind of, you know, connect on that? And of course, as you rightfully pointed out, how often is the board basically actually voting on it? Because that's going to determine that. So really great stuff here based on experiences from everybody. Okay, so stewardship, going back to the grant cycle, basically this is how you say thank you. As soon as you get that award letter or email, you need to go ahead and get a thank you letter out. That is the least you can do if you are from a village. You know, maybe have like a village letterhead with your board members listed on like one of the columns, and have a nice, you know, there are so many templates out there that you can easily just Google for a sample donation thank you letter. But you know, go from there, use that as a base, put some of your own information in there. Other ideas, do an impact video. You could get all of your board members, for example, just to do a really quick thank you on their cell phone, and then you could even stitch it together with some of the built-in tools on your cell phone. And you know, either you could text it, you could upload it to YouTube, and get that out as a you know, DIY thank you impact video that you could send to the grantor, and even, you know, get some video of the work that you're doing out in the community. Right here, going back to the whole timeline, most foundations are going to ask that you submit a formal report 1 to 1.5 years from receipt of the grant. That's typically what I have found with the majority of grants that I've worked with. And once you've spent the grant and reported back, that goes back, we talked about everything being cyclical, that starts kind of the clock over again for starting to plan for your next ask. So this is one of the main things we wanted to go over today, was a real life example. So if many of you are in a village, particularly a Maryland-based one, you may have already taken a look at this. It was the subject of some of the communications that went out in preparation for today's workshop. But we're just going to review this as a real life example and kind of just talk it over. I apologize in advance. These slides have a lot of words and not a lot of bullets, but I wanted to go through the RFP, kind of section by section, just to review it with you and talk it over. And I figured this was a little bit better way to do it than pulling up the actual PDF. But this is a great example of when we're talking about a request for proposals. This is a document going out by the Maryland Department of Aging for their FY25 Aging in Place grant. And, basically here they are laser focusing in on increasing resources and capacity. Going back to what we were talking before about capacity building, this is one of those types of grants to either local area agencies on aging or villages or nonprofits serving older Marylanders and their caregivers for services. In particular, you can see over here on the right, the services and projects they're looking to fund are preserving familiarity and independence for older adults in their environment, provide mental stimulation and engagement through different activities to delay cognitive decline and promote overall well-being. So you're getting an idea here. This is focused on health, reducing emotional stress, and then providing opportunities to live in a supported community. We already have right here on the chat. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for coming, Inez. Services to be funded through the opportunity. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, they lay it out right here exactly what they want funded. So the project, needs to be in this certain area, and then they need to provide kind of these services to actually get funded. But you can see on here, I'm just, brainstorming right now on the fly, but there are so many things that the villages are doing that would really fall under this. And even going back to what we were talking about earlier about forming partnerships, a good example is some of you that are in the Montgomery County area may be familiar with, Oasis of the Washington metro area, because they provide a lot of, programming for older adults in the area. And that's an example of a potential partner that you could work with in designing and executing, some of these programs to, whether it's stimulation, they have a lot of aging in place kind of programmatic activities, for example, and even going into transportation and social isolation reduction and engagement programs. That's a big one right now, I would say. Particularly among our older population. So, and that's a good example too of when you're looking at the need, there's so much research on social isolation right now. And I feel like I'm reading a new article basically every week, practically about that. So you've got a lot of choices basically. Going further into the RFP, they are talking about preferences given to projects that are able here on the left-hand side. This is good. Propose a multi-sector or multi-generational collaboration, going back to the partnerships and collaboration, establishing new villages or expanding existing villages into marginalized communities. So this is huge because we were talking before about what if you're not already a registered organization? Well, this is funding to help you establish a new village, which is fantastic. And then, volunteers, incorporating them into planning and delivery of the program or services, and expanding capacity, extending reach. So a lot of the things that may not be funded by other funders is being funded here. Now, as we go into the more details, the actual funding level, this is, I wish this is a bigger pool. They have a pool of $100,000 available to every organization that may be applying to this in Maryland. And 20% of that is being allocated for senior villages. Okay. So we had a, what's the correct verbiage for that? How would you describe your status? The status, I think you're referring to would be as a nonprofit, like are you registered already as a 501c3 and you've gone through all of that paperwork with being a registered business. And we're actually going to talk about SDAT in a second. That's a great question, and I would say that if you're not already in there, they have a, at the end, if you have the PDF, they have a person on there with contact information of who you can contact. They have a email address. Contact that person via email. They also have a phone number of that whole process, because going back to the whole chicken and egg thing, they are requesting that you already be in the Maryland state database to move forward. But then, of course, they're saying that this can be used to establish new villages. So they may be looking for partnerships there. And then I think we also had a hand raised earlier. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I think you're coming up on what many will find a challenge, which is the idea of matching funds. And if you could walk through the different ways to approach something like that.
Yeah, so on here with the matching funds, they are saying no more. They're only willing to fund 50% of the project's total costs. So that goes back to the whole sustainability thing of it even lays it out right here. They're defining that as dollar for dollar non-state resources. So going back to that, get creative, I would say, of how you can approach that with other funding
So one of the
opportunities.
questions,
But even here, it even says
one of the
that in
questions,
kind does count as
exactly,
services.
and costing out the volunteer time.
Yeah, and I apologize. I don't know that off the top of my head, but definitely Googleable of what the standard rate for that is.
It's
Of what
somewhere
you
around
can.
$34.
Okay.
Somewhere around there, 30 some dollars an hour.
Actually,
Yeah,
I'd like
that's
to add
perfect.
an extra question to that, because I wonder whether, in addition to just general volunteer hours, do they have equivalents for, say, the executive leadership? It's one thing to, because in villages, often it's the executive leadership, which is also all volunteer.
Mhm.
And so the question would be, are the payment scales or the equivalency that's allowed for matching? Is it always $34, whether you're driving a car or whether you're, the president of the organization?
Mhm. Oh, and we had a thing in the chat. The rate for volunteers varies by state. In Virginia, it's $33.08. Maryland is 34. So that's great. Thank you for that further context. So going into their actual application criteria, basically, do you fit those eligibility guidelines? Is your request within the allowable amount and that limit of 1-to-1? You have the matching, however that's calculated in your budget, and then you're actually providing the services. So fairly straightforward. I do think that, in this case, that match is going to be the barrier to overcome for everybody. And then down here, going to what we were talking about earlier, just aligning everything with the actual proposal. We were talking about before how you actually write the proposal. This goes into that basically with, the problem statement here is, what are you going to address when you're writing the narrative? Having those SMART goals, there it is again. Your outcomes measurement, how can you do that? and then, the organizational capacity. So, excuse me. And now, the actual application. So this is where you can see this is more or less the same, a little bit different than some of the examples we gave before, but it does come down to that. Who are you? What is the problem or unmet need in your community that you need to address? What is your project description? What are the outcomes? How are you going to manage that activity or program day to day? And then the actual sustainability of that. Okay. And then going into the other documents and attachments, so we have talked a little bit about budget narrative and the justification. This is interesting here. It does say administrative costs must be separated from service costs, and the provided template must be used. So they do have that template on there. They also have a template for the project work plan. So when we were talking about how a lot of funders will provide that for you, you have to fit within their guidelines. And then this is interesting, letters of support from all partner organizations. So only needed for organizations partnering with other entities. So I don't know if that is, necessarily, it does kind of seem a little bit like maybe they're leaning towards that. They want to see some collaboration there. Now down here in the cover letter, they're asking for some things, and I wanted to bring this up, the SDAT verification and the SAMs. So SDAT is basically you and the state having that relationship where you're registered as a business. And then SAMs is actually with the federal government and having that unique identifier there. I really want to point out, please start this early if you are eligible and you're going through that process. Get that done ahead of time versus later. In some cases with these Department of Aging grants, that verification may be something that you provide later. Here, though, they actually want it up front in the cover letter. So I know that the deadline for this one is coming up very quickly. So hopefully you have put a little bit of work into it already, but thinking ahead for future grants with the state of Maryland in particular, that's something that sooner rather than later always helps. All right, great. So the work plan, this is one of the templates they had attached in there. And going through this, this is just another great example of having it all laid out for you, but you're having to conform basically to these standards. So this isn't quite a logic model, but it does kind of remind me a little bit of that in terms of you have your objective and your inputs basically, and then what is the timeline for that, and how is it going to happen. So those are the basics of the RFP, and that's just a really good example of a grant that is an open one. Fortunately, that many on here are eligible, hopefully, to apply for, and hopefully you can do that by the deadline of next week. But I hope that everyone on here at least now has, a base level of understanding of this whole process. And hopefully if any of you thought it was a little bit, intimidating, we looked a little bit, where it's not going to be quite so much anymore. And I know some people are leaving right now, which is fine, but I wanted to go ahead and open it up. We were originally, based on the amount of people that registered, going to do actual breakout rooms, but in a small group format, if we would like to, we could open this up and just have a nice chat here at the end, because we do have another 25 minutes, basically, but just a few topics that we could go over is basically brainstorming, especially if you're a village, solving a problem in your community using a data-driven solution, outreach to new participants in your area, and coalition building, going back to building partnerships, and then going into outcomes, accountability, and data collection. So that can be a problem for smaller organizations. So we could talk through, just some more ideas. We've already talked about surveys and intake forms as two examples, but we could all, have a nice chat about what some of those may be. So Bill, you have your hand up. So if you'd like to
Yeah.
go ahead and say something or start.
I have a question about kind of the timeline it takes to become registered in the state of Maryland. I know in the state of Missouri, it does not take a super long time to do that, nor to become registered at the federal level and become a 501c3. Does anybody have any experience about how long it takes in Maryland to do that? So if someone, isn't registered today, is it feasible to do that by July 1st when the grant is due?
It is,
No,
it's Mary Jo, and I have some hard learned experience with that because we did not do it in advance, and that was a mistake. It takes time because you have to collect a lot of information. And when you are submitting various forms, you need to make sure that all of the data about your organization and its leadership and its mailing address or anything else, or its bank account, is all consistent. If your organization was founded 10 years ago and you have somebody else's name on a piece of paper, that's not going to work. So it does take time just prepping the data. And the same with the SAMs, which is the new federal government identity ID.
Mhm.
That too, in theory, it's supposed to be fairly simple. And if you have all of your ducks in a row, maybe it would be, but it takes a significant amount of time to make sure all of your materials are exactly in sync and ready to go.
Thanks.
Okay, we've got another hand up.
Bill, I didn't know if you were talking, for example, incorporation 501c3, that can be done fairly, if you haven't operated, if you're new and you don't have a record to explain, that can be done fairly quickly, but certainly not in time for a May 31st, deadline for this, but it can be done quite smoothly. One of the things that I would love to see with this grant application and other grant applications that have the SAMs and the SSTAT would be some technical assistance provided to nonprofits, to organizations that are applying in order to make it more possible for them to navigate that process. That could be a wonderful support. So for anyone who's listening from those granting organizations, if it's possible to bring that forward, I know our village would appreciate that, and I assume that other organizations would appreciate it as well.
Yeah, I would think that a lawyer who's been over this field before would be extremely useful in telling you where the hurdles are and where the barriers are.
It makes me think that perhaps it would be good to give a Zoom session on applying for those.
Yes,
Go
yes.
into the details. Here's what you need to line up.
Yeah.
It's a little too late. It's definitely too late for this session, but boy, I could have used that a long time ago. Well,
This
I'd
is
like
the first I've heard of this. Could you please explain what the SAMs and SSTAT is? Because I applied for this grant last year and I don't remember needing that. Maybe I did. I'm still new-ish as executive director, so I'm kind of lost.
Are you within a well-established organization? What is your
Yes.
organization?
Yes, it's Home Ports. We've been around for 16 years now.
You may have already been in the system if you're, especially since you're already established in Maryland. I presume that you've been having to file documents and reports and things like that over the years. So that would be one thing. But the SAMS is new. It was introduced by the federal government. It replaced an old ID. For example, you used to have to submit a DUNS number. And I guess the government doesn't like DUNS, and so they took it all on themselves. And now anyone wanting to do any business with the federal government at least must have a SAMS number. And since our WAVE funds were actually not state funds, they were federal COVID funds left over. So we did need to have to fulfill the federal SAMS ID requirement.
And we had a few
Someone-
comments in the chat about the difference between SAMS and EIN and a DUNS, and you still have your EIN, but you have to be registered in the SAMS system. And then if I could be talking out of school here, but basically once you're in there and kind of vice versa, then they between that and the SDAT system with the state of Maryland, you they have to both be in sync in a certain sense.
Right.
And then we have another hand up as well.
Raquel, was that you?
Yes, yes, it is. So I've been asking, questions only because I have had my business for, I want to say my village for a year now. And I have seniors, I have about 8 seniors. And what I'm trying to do is merge young adults and seniors in a family residential setting, independent living, promoting independent living and community and all that stuff. But I have not yet got my 501c. I did hear I think it's Miss Layla say something about forming partnerships with some, other nonprofits or 501c nonprofits. How would I do that exactly? How would I do that in such a short time?
It doesn't sound like you have the time to apply for this grant, honestly.
That is going to be difficult. And
Would it be possible for you to find a fiscal agent to work through? I know that's not hugely popular with federal grants, but that would be a potential solution if you could find a fiscal agent with a viable track record and, a good reputation to work through.
So would that be
some?
someone that already have a 501c?
Well, yes, they would. I mean, they would have to be eligible to receive federal funding or state funding, as the case may be.
Well, then, yes.
They
someone like
act through as a pass-through entity,
Mhm.
to subsequently fund your organization. But it's not uncommon in the early stages of a 501c3 environment when you're waiting on your IRS determination or, you have capacity limitations, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, I do know someone like that already have their 501c and all that I could probably partner with.
It's easy to find boilerplate fiscal agent contracts online, and you could execute a fairly straightforward boilerplate fiscal agent contract that would oblige that entity to receive funds on your behalf. They usually take a cut, but they're having to do a lot of paperwork, so that's fair. There's a reason they're taking that cut. But that might be a solution until you get through the IRS pipeline.
Thank you.
Hopefully you're welcome. Hopefully it benefits you.
So Raquel and Mary Jo, please jump in if I'm speaking out of turn on this. One of my thoughts would be, and this isn't for this grant timeline, I'm not suggesting it for this, but if you haven't already made contact with the Baltimore County government, the Department of Aging, to be able to reach out to the BCDA and talk with them about the ideas that you have and what you're trying to work toward, and see if they are able to provide any services and supports for you in the work that you're doing, and to build that relationship. Once again, that's not going to be something that's going to get you to a May 31st deadline, but for longer term planning, to be able to make that contact. And I only have basic information, so I defer to others who may better know, or to tell me that that's not an appropriate place to start.
Thank you again.
And on our website, we will have contact information from slides from our afternoon program today for the woman who is head of the Baltimore County Department of Aging office, which has issued their RFPs, and she herself had founded a village. So I think she's very understanding of the challenges. And if you email me, president@wavevillages.org, and repeat your question and what you're trying to do, I will be happy to put you in contact with her. That's president@wavevillages.org.
Thank you. I got it.
And Layla, I saw in the chat you were asking that you want a clear example of objectives, methods, and measures, just from like the grant perspective of overall. And we can talk about
Yes.
this a little bit more offline if you'd like to, but basically, the objective of it's basically what you're trying to do. The method is how you're going to do it. And then the measure is literally how you actually measure the impact of what you're doing. So there's so many ways to do that, but basically, under objectives like what are you trying to do, and how are you doing it? So you're basically building that whole continuum, and it starts with what is the problem that needs to be solved, and what is my methodology to solve that problem. So with social isolation, going back to this particular RFP, is there a program that you can put in place that is using best practices? I don't know if we talked about this before, but what are some best practices that are used across the country to address social isolation, whether that is, in specific, communities, whatever it may be. Just look at some things that other nonprofits are doing, and maybe it's a model that hasn't been introduced here. That's typically what happens with a lot of nonprofit programs. Someone is going to do all the innovation, and once you have the proof of concept that it actually works, then it'll spread like wildfire. So maybe there's something we're not doing here in this community to address that particular issue, that you kind of take that baton and run with it. And then while you're actually doing it, you need to look at those various tools for measuring the outcome. I guess we can go back to the question I had on here that was going to be a breakout room. This seems to be an issue that some people are struggling with. Does anyone here have any great success as a smaller organization with data collection or outcomes and evaluation that they would like to kind of talk about to the group? Has there been a program that you've implemented that has had success and you've been able to demonstrate that?
I'd just like to sort of clarify something here, and Bill Kincaid would certainly jump in here. It's the difference between outputs and outcomes, and I hate to sound technical, but villages can measure their outputs: how many rides they've given, how many parties they've thrown, how many times the walking group has walked, how many times the The gardening group has gardened. And they can, with difficulty, because this is all volunteer stuff, they can, with difficulty, collect that data. But on social isolation specifically, there are only one or two really, I think, validated survey instruments. And they actually require the village or who is ever doing it to go back out and execute that survey with their, like a before and after. It has, have you felt lonely today? Do you feel that you have enough friends? Are you feeling depressed? I think even we've all been to our doctor's office where they're probably asking us those questions. These are the standard questions. But to truly measure outcomes in a valid way, the village would have to execute that survey at the beginning of the project, all about loneliness, which is very, very private, and they'd have to persuade their members to do it. And then at the end of their project, they'd have to measure again and show that it had improved. And I
We
think,
have the same problem.
and there are many of us who believe that this is a huge, huge barrier for any small organization, especially, but even large organizations.
Thank you, Mary Jo. That's where I was going, is really,
Right.
how do you tangle with that?
Right. So I think that, realistically speaking, for a village to measure social isolation outcomes, it would help if we could come up with something short of that validated survey mechanism that would pass the sniff test, let's be honest, for demonstrating that you really made an impact, but would be far less, would actually be a feasible way of measuring it.
Yeah, I think they need to select some of the salient questions that's in that larger questionnaire and ask those. Because I think asking a villager to fill out, 20 pages of information is not going to get us anywhere. So I think we need to look at the really critical issues that we think we're influencing and figure out how valid that new shorter instrument is to be able to approach this. And for that, we need some help from, some university-based researchers who can abstract that critical information for us.
And honestly, in our rural community, we get pushback on a one-pager.
Yeah. Yeah. And it may be that the best approach to this is looking at how active the villager is in the village. Does he go to the coffee klatch? Does he go to social events? So I think there are other ways to get at this by using kind of a hybrid methodology. But you're right. I think if we ask everybody to fill out a large questionnaire every day, it's not going to happen.
I think some of them are a little bit shorter, but they're still, they're quite intrusive, and a lot of villages aren't going to want to say, gee, did I feel depressed or did I feel alone?
Yeah, it really gets at the trust relationship that you're trying to work with your members in ways that, if the work begins with asking questions, however few, that are in a survey form, there's an immediate reaction to that versus the way, let's say, drivers and other volunteers might carry out some fact finding in conversation. It's just the format in itself creates a level where it no longer feels like community. It delivers more as a clinical or more as a administrative overreach. I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that.
So
when you figure it out, let us know.
Well, I think there's some real value in the interaction that occurs between a driver and the person that's being driven. And some villages are saying, well, we're not going to do transportation because transportation can be done other ways, and it's more efficient that way. But I think having the driver there as an observer is an extremely useful process for gathering information and figuring out what's going on. So I think we undersell the value of a ride if we just say Uber can do it, because I don't think they can do the kind of evaluation and the kind of continuous evaluation that I think is so critical.
And Bill, one of our new board members, valuable volunteer driver as well, brought forward how much more we can accomplish as a village by making sure that our drivers are very informed and that our drivers are we do a lot of interacting and sharing during our driving, but for there to be some focused sharing and information gathering in those occasions, because often if you're driving someone to Baltimore from where we live, or driving someone to Bethesda, you're spending a little bit of time together, and just what comes out of that process could be very valuable.
And a lot of times the entry that goes in to help a village or run my village is, how did your ride go? Fine. That's not good enough. We need more detail. Show your work.
So this was pointed out in the chat, but in the actual PDF, we were just looking at some slides where I cut it up. On the last few pages, you do have the links to several outcome tools, measurement tools. This being the one suggested for measuring loneliness. It was pointed out in the chat also that your N is going to be low. That's statistics speak for population based, and that's, you have your population, and then, the number of people that actually would respond to the surveys and everything. So maybe if you are, let's say, going in this route, think creatively about how you can get respondents to actually, fill this out versus just, sending it out by email or something like that and hoping for the best. Being a little bit more proactive, perhaps, could work in that case. But yeah, it is a barrier here. And even Mary Jo, what you were talking about, having to do a pre and post test, this is getting into really very academic level kind of research. So
well, it would have to be done in a way that was, again, as Layla used the word trust, which I think is just absolutely essential when you're talking about villages. Those are very intrusive questions. And you just have to ask how many older people they're in the village, and then somebody starts asking them, well, do you feel depressed? How many friends do you have? I think that there's almost like a contradiction in terms between the village even asking those questions. Unfortunately, I think it actually damaged the relationship of the participant, the member, to the village.
Mm.
And so I think it was Bill who was saying the idea, and this is difficult for villages. It's a bandwidth issue. If you're going to have your volunteers really almost be taking the survey by saying, Layla, we noticed that Layla hadn't been participating, but she's come to the last 3 socials, and, I noticed that she had more conversation. So something that, you would anonymize the person you're talking about, but talking about a change in participation, interaction, and how the behaviors that you've observed. But in order to do that across the membership, that is a whole nother bandwidth challenge, for something like that. But just trying to think of something that isn't somebody saying, oh, I feel terribly depressed now, 6 months later, everything's fine, type of thing. Because we also recognize that those are very much affected by the moment, how those questions will present.
And that's why I think it's important to get people into villages early so that they can age in the village and get to know people and feel more comfortable. Because that issue of trust, this is part of the social contract that you enter into when you're in a village. You got my back, I've got your back. we'll deal with this. And I think that's part of the process for what villages need to do. And waiting till somebody is 85 and bringing it into a village is much more difficult than bringing somebody in when they're 55 and having them age through the process and become part of the community.
From your mouth to everyone's ears.
I think we're at time. And Seth, if you would go ahead and put that last slide up, because it's got follow-up and contact information on it.
Yeah, just we are at basically just a temperature check. How is we don't have to actually put this in the chat now, but how's everybody feeling now that we've talked this through a little bit? Hopeful. And any last questions, since we are over on time, Mary Jo will share my contact information. And of course, you can find me on LinkedIn as well. But thank you all for your time. I hope it at least was, informative of getting the basics down and how you can move forward with this, because it seems daunting. The more you submit, the better you're going to get at it. So it just takes practice.
Well, it does occur to me that another thing that perhaps WAVE could do is to convene a little, what we call a mutual support facilitated, Zoom mutual support discussion around this issue of documentation and measurement and outcomes and things like that. And we could share our ideas and our experiences and see if we can come up with feasible, valid, meaningful ways to demonstrate the importance of what we're doing, because we certainly understand that funders deserve to know that their money accomplished something. So we all want to get to the same place, and maybe a session on that would be in order. So we may be reaching out to you. So in the meantime, that's where you're going to find the video and slides very soon, Archive of WAVE Events. And please, you can feel free to email me or just our general email, washingtonareavillages@gmail.com. And we'd be happy to hear from you and try and follow up. And I want to thank Chelsea Wheeler for sitting through this. It's her grant that we've been picking apart and talking about. And I can just say that I think she's a terrific grant officer, and I'm happy to work with her. And I hope she doesn't mind that we made her grant a sort of a guinea pig for this. And so thank you to you all.